Aloha, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of KalikoVision. I'm your host, Kaliko Castillo, CEO here at Thunderstorm Strategies. Really looking forward to today's conversation with my good friend, Kevin Cronin. He's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Housing Oregon. And this is obviously one of the biggest issues in all of politics, no matter what state you live in, but specifically here in Oregon. Housing has been a very big topic of discussion. People obviously in Portland, people talk about houselessness a lot, talking about homelessness. Today, I actually want to dive into the details a little bit with Kevin, who's been doing a really great job in the work that they're doing at Housing Oregon. And for folks who don't know, Housing Oregon is actually a statewide association of 75 affordable housing and community development organizations, businesses, and government agencies. They advocate on the local and state levels for programs and policies to expand affordable housing. I've known Kevin for quite some time, almost 10 years now, dating back to some work that we were doing in the medical cannabis sphere. But then I know he's been doing great work in the labor organizing side of things, and then now at Housing Oregon. So, Kevin, really appreciate you joining me today, and welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Kaliko. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Absolutely. And just such an important topic, like I was saying about housing. I think us millennials, people who are just getting into the age of being able to buy a house, are really being able to deal with that head on in terms of like how expensive housing is if you're trying to buy. Obviously, rents are extremely high in some places. I live here in Milwaukee. Just saw some recent new developments go up, and the baseline price for a studio apartment, I believe, was like $1,500, was quite a bit higher than even the average rent here, or the average salary here in Milwaukee. But I'm sure that is replicated throughout the state. So looking forward to having the conversation. And before we kind of get into the housing side, would love for you to maybe just explain a little bit about your background. I know we met when we were doing some work on the medical cannabis side, but at the time, I believe you were working in the Oregon State Legislature and doing labor organizing. Why don't you tell us a little bit about sort of your background and how you kind of came into working in Oregon politics?
Sure. I moved here in about 2006 and went to community college at PCC. I got involved in student government there and transferred to the University of Oregon. I got involved in campaigns and elections. And really importantly, at the U of O, I got a no cause eviction notice. And so that really put on my radar quite early the housing issue and topic for folks from my age group. After graduation, I worked for the SEIU State Council and worked for Representative Julie Fahey and Senator James Manning. And then I got no cause evicted again in 2016 and 2015. And so, my focus sort of started shifting to organizing renters. And my friends and I, we helped sort of build the Springfield Eugene Tenant Association. And so that really got me leveled up on my sort of policy chops around housing. And so I decided to go work for my local housing authority, Homes for Good Housing Agency in Eugene. And then after a year or so, I became union president there, and got to do a lot of bargaining and stuff during COVID. And so after a few years at Homes for Good, I wanted to marry sort of my housing passion and campaign and policy experience, and this job at Housing Oregon came up.
I didn't realize you had gone through two of your own no cause evictions, like kind of leading you down this path. And I can imagine, like you said, that sort of like brought you headfirst into sort of this policy area that maybe you hadn't given a lot of thought to prior. But can you explain what a no cause eviction is? Like, maybe for people who have not had that experience yet, and maybe even after you had that happen to you, even the first and second time, what are some lessons learned that maybe were you're right as a tenant as you started to work to organize some of those tenants?
Yeah. So, back in the day, I guess in 2011, when I first got my first notice, your landlord could give you 30 days notice and you had to leave. And there was no sort of repercussion. You couldn't challenge it in court. You couldn't do anything, and you just had to leave. And so that of course puts a huge economic burden on someone trying to come up with first, last, and a deposit. And so, I ended up having to sleep on my friend's porch in a hammock. And I know a lot of, that's couch surfing, and a lot of folks in our age group have sort of had that experience and had to rely on friends and family to find a spot to lay their head. And so in 2019, we had a major reform with Senate Bill 608, which extended the notice period to 90 days, and basically came up with 4 reasons why your landlord could use this no-cause eviction. But recently, at the city of Eugene level, back in July of this year, those that are facing no-cause evictions now get 2 months of relocation assistance, and that's a new policy win, and it's effective as of August 25th. So that's really cool.
That's huge. So you're saying when you first got your first couple of eviction notices at the time, you were only able to have up to 30 days notice, or only required to get 30 days notice from your landlord. And at that time, there was no repercussion to be able to appeal that decision or to go to court for that. And you're saying now, because of that Senate bill, there's actually a 90-day window for folks to actually have that that notification and still have the ability to potentially try to fight it, or do they not have the ability to fight it still?
It's still really hard to fight.
Sure. But I mean, even extending that period out, almost 3 times what it was originally is huge. And then you were saying this sort of local win, and Eugene is actually saying you can have rental or have assistance to actually relocate. If somebody is giving you this no cause eviction, you actually can have some sort of assistance, of some form of assistance, to get that last months to get into your next place.
Exactly that. The city of Portland also has that protection. And really, folks who came before in Portland really inspired that. But I just have to plug our local win that we fought for years, and it just came into effect this month. So we're super excited about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's huge. I think that so many people, often when I'm having conversations with folks about why, getting involved in politics or electoral politics matters, it's these sort of things, right? Like, even around the margins, that's big time, helping people to get a little bit more time to get their legs under them, and then actually having a little bit of a financial footing to do so, right? Not kind of just, as you said, having to couch surf or be on a hammock to just kind of figure out where you're going to lay your head the next night. So great work for you and others who have been working on those sort of things. I know, you laid out that like new victory in Eugene. What are some of the things that maybe this last legislative session that you guys were working on? Obviously, this was a big thing that going into the legislative session, everybody sort of saw this as being one of the top issues and something that they really wanted to focus on. I know the governor had brought this up during her sort of race before she was elected. So what are some of the things that the Housing Oregon has been specifically focused on as it relates to this last legislative session?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Housing Oregon is really focused on, and we represent the nonprofit affordable housing developers. So those are the folks that run income-based low-income rentals that are regulated housing. So this legislative session, we saw a historic investment in housing and homelessness. We had a huge investment in Article 11 Q bonds, which allow the state to raise money off of the improvements made to the property. We saw a historic investment in private activity bonds, which really help folks in our industry create new housing. And then we also saw a number of new consumer protections for renters. So, there's a cap on rent increases at 10% statewide. And then we also saw some changes to evictions, which allow folks to tap into rent assistance if they're facing a for-cause non-payment eviction. And essentially that allows someone to cure up until their court date. So we added a lot of these policies in an attempt to prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place, because it costs far less to assist someone to remain in their house than to house someone directly off of the street.
Yeah, that's a great point. I feel like that's something that we really kind of saw kind of come to the forefront during COVID, right? Where we had a lot of this sort of direct assistance provided to renters and to workers to make sure that we were not getting to that place where we had a even worse situation with houselessness. So, can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of like when we're thinking about the macro housing policy in Oregon? You hear a lot about how we don't have enough housing. You talk about how the cost is too high. And, I hear you talking about how the sort of constituency for Housing Oregon is the actual developers who are developing these low income housing opportunities for people. When you're kind of looking aside from just kind of the protections for consumers, on the macro side, what are some of the things that we need to be seeing from a policy perspective to make sure that we are getting the housing volume that we need and making sure that we are hopefully not seeing continual increases in rent? I know the governor had put out some potential statements and stuff, but what are your guys' perspective on kind of the macro, larger policies that need to get us to that sort of the place we need to be with housing, not just sort of protecting people from the eviction, which, as you pointed out, is a better place upstream to solve the problem. But what is sort of the long-term vision or plan?
Yeah, I mean, so first and foremost, we need to build more housing, and that is clear. We need to build 36,000 units a year in order to meet our goals over the next 10 years, in order to make sure that everybody has a place to live. And so we are not anywhere close to that, and I don't think that we will be anywhere close to that by the end of this year or even next year. But the goal is to really ramp up construction and investment. So that starts with making it easier to build, by working with local jurisdictions like cities and counties, to find out how much like housing they need to build in their community, and making sure that the housing that we build sort of fits within their community. So rural areas are different than urban areas. A lot of people drive, and so you got to sort of look at a little bit further out from the city center when you're dealing with rural areas. So the governor advanced a number of really important legislation that helps cities be that partner, and also there's other things like office conversions. There was a bill that passed to sort of make that process easier. There's a number of challenges related to plumbing and sort of electrical infrastructure for those types of conversions, but we see the legislature taking action to sort of encourage that activity. And then
One of the things I actually wanted to ask about, because it was a big deal here in Clackamas County, you were kind of starting to touch on it, was like Project Turnkey, right? That's something that maybe people have heard the word Project Turnkey, but can you talk a little bit about that effort and the idea that you are there is some conversion to existing buildings to try to provide housing for folks?
Yeah, so Project Turnkey is really great. The first phase of Project Turnkey converted 19 different hotel motels across Oregon to new housing and shelter. And so every Project Turnkey is different and has a number of challenges associated with it. So if you've seen one Project Turnkey, you've seen one Project Turnkey. And so they're going to the state has made a second investment for Project Turnkey 2.0. And we're really excited to see those get rolled out. But a lot of these Project Turnkeys, especially here in Lane County, our Project Turnkey was first used as emergency housing for those that were displaced by the Labor Day fires from 2020 or 2021. And then you see those projects being converted to more permanent supportive housing, which is housing with wraparound services that's specifically designed to house high need folks right off of the street.
Yeah, I know I would mention Clackamas County had recently, this had come up because we had a big vote in Clackamas County like earlier this year where there was a plan to purchase a motel here just right near the Clackamas Town Center. And the Clackamas County Commissioners had actually made the vote to approve the funds in order to be able to receive the project turnkey money from the state and combine it with the money from Metro in order to purchase the building. But then the county commissioner or county chair, Tootie Smith, had changed her vote weeks later and actually had ended up putting a kibosh on the deal. So Clackamas County actually lost out on the funds that were potentially going to be allocated for Project Turnkey. And what was crazy to me during that like debate was that they'd actually shown that it was going to be more expensive for the county to go forward with killing this deal than it would have been to take the deal, because we would have been able to house people at even a lower cost per night than we were going to do currently, right? And it was something like $3 million. It was multi-million dollars that we ended up we're going to end up losing not only on funds from the state, but also that we're going to have to expend more of because of the way that we're going forward. So it's great that some communities are being able to take advantage of these programs, and aggravating that there are other counties like Clackamas that have chosen to not prioritize this at a time when we are seeing so many people struggling.
Yeah, there was a tremendous organizing effort that went into organizing for that Project Turnkey in Clackamas County, and it was a real disappointment to see Chair Smith take that position. These opportunities for state funding are competitive, and if you aren't able to capitalize and move forward, then somebody else in our state is going to do that. So when you lose an opportunity, it's a real bummer.
Yeah. Another thing I had been hearing about, because this is something I'm still learning about. I don't know a lot about housing policy, right? I know rent's too high. I know it's hard to get a house, but it's really hard for me to know all of the policy stuff. But one of the things that I had heard here in Milwaukee a couple of years ago was they had taken a vote around in exclusionary zoning and doing stuff around sort of like access other secondary units, right? Or basically opening up what you can build within a certain city. Can you talk a little bit about, I know you talked about local, like having partners at the local level. Can you talk about some of the ways in which local policy affects housing policy more broadly?
Yeah, so inclusionary zoning, essentially, if you are building a new development, a certain portion of those units must be affordable for those with lower incomes. And so we see cities like the city of Portland has an inclusionary zoning policy. There are some developers that are more of the for-profit private developers, and they have balked, and it's been a real tough challenge for the city of Portland to enforce the inclusionary zoning. There has been a school of thought that inclusionary zoning is one of those things that discourages new development. Now, there's been some new research that has been published in the last 6 weeks that actually challenges that school of thought. And so, I have yet to dig into that, but that's really interesting. Other parts of the state have inclusionary zoning that gets paired with, say, a multi-unit property tax exemption or MUPTI. And essentially, if you're going to get a tax credit to do an infill project, then a portion of those units that you build have to be affordable. Now, some jurisdictions allow you to get out of inclusionary zoning by instead paying like a fine, and that fine gets sort of earmarked and goes to support other local housing projects. So there's a couple different ways, and with a variety of success for the inclusionary zoning.
Yeah, thank you for that. It kind of, as you were talking, it reminded me a little bit of the Ritz-Carlton that's being built in downtown Portland, because I remember there being stories about some portion of that building needing to have affordable housing provided in it. Is that kind of along the same ideas in terms of like you're getting access to this real estate, but you're having to have some set aside? And then I believe there was a story about them potentially not making good on that, or maybe they had to pay the fine. Do you know or remember anything about kind of that situation specifically?
I'm not specifically familiar with that project, but there has been media coverage of some projects in the city of Portland that are not meeting their obligations for inclusionary zoning.
And When you talk about the enforcement mechanism for that, is that usually come down to like a city council simply just fining a company or a developer, or what does like the enforcement mechanism look like around that?
It's really difficult to say. The city of Portland, in particular, has a lot of challenges. You have more than one different planning office, and so there's a lot of different coordination or lack of coordination that sort of happens. There's a new proposal by Commissioner Rubio to sort of merge all of the planning departments into one, which Housing Oregon supports and thinks that's a good idea. But with the sort of transition to a new Portland City Charter, the sort of status of different bureaus of the city of Portland have a lot of uncertainty. And so we don't know what leadership's going to look like in those departments a year from now. And that has been really tough. And you see a lot of senior level folks moving for other opportunities.
Yeah, that's a great point. It is definitely a lot of stuff in flux right now. And I appreciate sort of the idea that like it's obviously going to be different in each city in terms of like the enforcement mechanism for some of these things, but that's fascinating to me that there are obligations that are not being met at a time when things are so bad, and that sometimes city or local county governments might feel ill-equipped or under-resourced in order to go after those folks and make sure that they are making good on their obligations, right? Because if we are making the good faith effort to enter into these deals with developers, we would hope that they are actually going to make good on their end of the bargain there. I know another thing that obviously comes up for renters often is just simply month-to-month rent increases. Can you give us any information about sort of like what the current state of things are in terms of like what's allowed from a rent increase standpoint? I know there's been some articles about that over the last year, but I'm quite unsure of like exactly where things stand.
Yeah, so there was a huge piece of legislation, Senate Bill 611, that passed during the legislative session, and the governor signed it July 6th. So as of July 6th, any notices that have been issued for a rent increase of more than 10% are invalid. Now, there's one huge exception, and that's folks that live in new construction or buildings that were less than 15 years old. So personally, just before Christmas last year, my landlord sent me a rent increase of $786 a month. And so my rent went from it was like $1,450 to something like $2,200.
I'm just so glad you do this work because you have the worst rent luck. Like you have the worst landlord luck. That's unbelievable.
My wife and I were very lucky to, we went into a program for first time home buyers, and we were able to buy a house this March. Awesome. So we are so lucky. We had 1 month of that rent, and our mortgage is about the same as what we would be paying. So we are very lucky to be able to buy a home. And, I am so, like, not having a landlord has improved my health. My blood pressure has dropped by about 20 points. And so let me tell you, but the law of the land as of July 6th is you can't have your rent increase by more than 10% if your building was built before 2008.
Got it. No more than 10% if it was built before 2008. That's really great information. I feel it's something that probably most people do not know. It would be great information to be armed with when you can potentially be able to go to a landlord who either A, is unaware of that, or B, doesn't give a damn and is still trying to charge you that. So I appreciate that information. Hopefully that will arm some folks and help protect them because I think that's part of the sort of like race to the top that seems to be happening with so many people is everyone looks around and sees that there's a more expensive rate right down the street from them, so they ended up raising it, and there's just continual sort of like arms race of increasing rent prices. So it's good that we are able to finally start putting a cap on that and making sure that landlords are having somewhat reasonable expectations in terms of like being able to increase that. This is more on like, I guess, like a personal side before we jump into talking about you guys' upcoming conference at the end of the month. But, I am, I'll just put this out there and then maybe you can respond however you would like to respond. But I think like in general, it seems like our country still has this sense of entitlement when it comes to investing in real estate, especially as people, like, we feel like it was so sold to people that like, having your own home is like one of the best single investments you can make as a individual. And then it kind of, in the housing crisis prior to 2008 and even still afterwards, there's this whole push for people to really use real estate as an easy investment vehicle for them. And so I feel like it's now creating this sense of entitlement where people feel like if they can't own a bunch of homes, then we're doing something wrong. But I have to wonder if like the Airbnb culture and the sort of culture of people making money off of just simply owning housing, does that going and playing into this macro issue of housing stability and housing problems? Because it just seems to me that we are having a whole generation of people who think the only way you can make money is to invest in real estate. And it seems like we have to, from a policy perspective, end up putting an end on that or put some sort of upper limitation on how many investment properties somebody can have or something along those lines. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts along those lines.
I mean, that's what you said is very true. And so I don't know of any current movements to sort of put a cap on things. What I can tell you though is that organizations that invest in new home ownership opportunities for sort of working families are critical. And it's critical that the state continue to invest in home ownership opportunities. So in the Portland metro area, you have groups like Proud Ground and Habitat for Humanity. Proud Ground essentially has this program which is called a community land trust, which essentially they own the land, but you own the house that is on there. And that has a permanent affordability sort of restriction on it. And basically you can build equity in your home and resell it, and you can build that wealth. But that house is going to be more affordable. And so you have that model emerging. In other parts of the state, you have what is called a limited equity co-op, which essentially Square One Villages is sort of leading the way on that front. And essentially, you can buy in for as low as $5,000 and have a home ownership opportunity and build equity and not have your mortgage go to making somebody else wealthy, but to making sure that you sort of have that so that if you want to move on from that opportunity, you will have an ability to make a sizable down payment somewhere else. And so those types of models bring up one of the most important pieces of legislation that I think that did not pass and really didn't get a lot of attention, but was Senate Bill 606, which is a tenant or community opportunity to purchase. And so what that is basically if your landlord is going to sell your unit or your multifamily building, that you either living in your single family home can make an offer to purchase, or you as a committee of tenants can make an offer to purchase your multifamily building and then sort of have that limited equity cooperative model. And so I think that that's one of the ways that we as working class people can sort of own our own homes instead of having somebody else own the home.
That's fascinating that there are some of these additional models popping up, and I like this idea of limited equity, or like the idea that the county or the the government could potentially own the land and then just kind of end up having the ability to have those cheaper down payments for folks. That's super awesome. And then one of the other things I've heard from people in some of these discussions was the idea that for if you're having affordable housing or people developing on affordable housing, that you might have things like 99-year leases, right? So that you actually have to extend that out. And if you aren't being held accountable to some of those things, then you can end up revoking those leases. Is that something that is ever in play, or if you've seen here in Oregon at all?
So most of the community land trust models are built on sort of the 99-year lease sort of
Got it.
framework. But another factor at play is long-term affordability restrictions. So most of the federal programs for regulated affordable housing only have a 30-year affordability period. And so we are seeing
Right.
that those periods are expiring for all the housing that
Now.
was built in the 90s. And that's alarming.
Yeah.
So in order to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future, we need to advocate for 60 or 90 or 100-year affordability restrictions. That way, when we build affordable housing, it stays affordable housing.
Count me in on that effort, because I definitely agree that, like, I've heard about that 30-year stuff kind of coming up right about now. So it does seem like something that we need to be advocating for, and actually takes us into our next thing I wanted to chat with you about. You guys have an upcoming conference and gala here in Portland at the end of the month, and I would love it if you could sort of talk a little bit about what it is that you guys are planning on talking about at the conference, maybe some of the partners that you guys are bringing together, and just in general plug some of the stuff that you guys will be talking about.
Sure. So the Housing Oregon Conference happens every year. It's one of the largest housing conferences in the country, actually. We had over 830 attendees. It's a hybrid event, so you can attend stuff online via Zoom, but it's at the Portland Doubletree Hotel. It's a great place to sort of network and learn about housing. We have a affordable housing development 101. So if you're interested in sort of looking at affordable housing as a career, that's a great place to sort of dive in. And then this year on the first day, on September 26th, we're doing what is called the Oregon Community Reinvestment Summit. And so in response to redlining back in the day, Congress passed this thing called the Community Reinvestment Act, which essentially says that banks that have branch offices must make loans to communities within 5 miles of their branch office. And so if you don't meet your Community Reinvestment Act obligations, then you can't merge or acquire other banks. So right now we have several different bank mergers happening, notably Columbia and Umpqua Bank are merging. And so we've been doing a lot of organizing in advocating for what would go in to that new bank meeting its Community Reinvestment Act obligations. And so at our conference, Umpqua Bank is going to announce their plans to invest in low income and communities of color in Oregon as a way to finalize their bank merger deal. And so we're also pressuring BMO, which is and Bank of the West, which are merging, U.S. Bank and Union Bank, which are merging, and Key Bank, which is making a huge acquisition in signing these types of agreements.
Well, you are informing me that all these bank mergers are happening. That's an awesome leverage point in terms of making sure that they are making good on that Community Reinvestment Act obligations. And great that Umpqua is going to be there at your guys' event to actually be announcing that they're going to be making good on their obligation as part of that merger. That's excellent. I'm going to take a look at tickets and try to come myself. I'm super interested in learning more about the stuff. That's why I really appreciate you coming on and sharing a little bit of your knowledge with us. And I know in this new role as Director of Policy and Advocacy at Housing Oregon, you'll be getting deep into the weeds on some really important work here in the years to come. I know you had mentioned obviously one of the bills that didn't pass this last legislative session. What is it that you guys are looking for into the 2024 session in terms of like priorities going forward?
So one of our big priorities has been following the Joint Task Force on Racial Disparities in Home Ownership. And so the legislature did all this really important work that identified some ways that we can bridge the gap between white homeowners and everybody else. And white people are much more likely to own their own home. And so there's a number of different policy solutions that were proposed, but the Oregon legislature hasn't really made any headway on any of these items. So I think we'll see in legislative days sort of a hearing to take accountability of that. And then in the short legislative session coming up, Housing Oregon is going to do a full court press to make sure that we can pass some of these key policy items to advance the task force's recommendations.
Well, that's excellent. I appreciate you guys continuing to keep the fight going on, as you said, for working people, to making sure that we do have safe and healthy homes to be able to be living in. I appreciate all your work at Housing Oregon, all this work you've done in Oregon politics in general, and very much for joining us on KalikoVision. What's a way that people can get a hold of you or get involved with Housing Oregon if they want to learn more?
Sure. They can email me, kevin@housingoregon.org. We accept individual members as well as affiliate members. We also need volunteers for our conference. So if you want to come and sort of work the front desk for a couple hours, or we need folks to be Zoom monitors to help bridge the hybrid gap, you can email me and we can set you up with a free ticket if you are interested in helping out and learning more about housing.
Awesome. Make sure you go to housingoregon.org to get your tickets to their conference. Learn more. They have a great list of resources, as well as going over all of the list of wins and policy stuff that they're working on. You can check it out at housingoregon.org. Kevin Cronin, thank you so much for your time, man. Appreciate all the work you're doing. And thank you everyone else for tuning in to another episode of KalikoVision. Aloha.
Take care. Bye.